Hey everybody, it's Screenplay Archaeology host KiramidHead here, and once again I have forgotten to do certain plugs at the beginning of the episode. This time it's different plugs, but in this case I forgot to shout out the podcast I normally shout out in the body of the episode, so I'm going to do that now. And as you can tell, I've been forgetting to do this kind of stuff a lot lately on these solo episodes. I couldn't tell you why. But yeah, if you're interested in the subject matter of this show, check out the Shelved podcast. And if you're interested in hearing live, full reads of these sorts of scripts, check out the Table Reads podcast. They do blind, full-length reads of unproduced scripts, including some of the same ones I've covered, including some stuff I haven't covered yet, but we'll get around to. So if you're curious about some of that stuff, definitely check them out. And of course, check out Shelved because he does, similar to what I do, but a slightly different format. So yeah, that about covers it. And, just feel free to jump right into the episode from here on out. Alright everyone, hello and welcome to a new episode of the Screenplay Archaeology podcast. I'm your host KiramidHead, and tonight I bring you a new solo episode, this time focused around a script for a remake of the classic Dario Argento horror film Suspiria, written by David Gordon Green, who just recently got a bit of a horror cred for directing the successful reboot/sequel Halloween 2018, and will be continuing to direct two more films in the Halloween series, Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends. At least that's what they're titled at this point. And he wrote it along with his sound guy, Chris Gabert. Pardon me if I'm mispronouncing that. And it's dated in 2012, so this is a while ago, and it predates the actual remake that we got. And it follows the same general outline of the original movie, in that it's a young girl who, she goes to, attend this exclusive academy in Germany. In this version, it's just like an all-girls boarding school. It's not a dance school specifically. But she goes there, weird stuff's going on, there's people who are dying in weird, semi-supernatural kind of ways. And there is a strong supernatural element that ties into the history and what the power behind the school actually is. I'll leave it at that for now. And before I go into, the meat of the episode, I'd just like to point out, once again, I'm going to do the plugs. If you have any questions or concerns, you can contact us at screenplayarchaeology@outlook.com. Outlook may be a pain, but I do try to respond to emails as promptly as I can. We're on Facebook, Tumblr, and Twitter. And you can get this show in many places. You can get podcasts. Just check the RSS feed. We're on Podbean. You can get the RSS feed pretty easily. And you can search us up in any sort of podcast platform. We're on iTunes and Stitcher Radio. And from the last episode I put up till now, I actually got us up on Spotify and Google Play Music. I sent an application into Pandora. They still have not gotten back to me with either acceptance or rejection, so I'm just going to assume they haven't even gotten to the fucking application yet, because who knows if they don't say anything. But yeah, we're there. And also, as I always say, I will read out iTunes reviews, or it's probably just going to be Apple Podcasts from now on in the future, since they're disbanding iTunes and doing whatever the fuck they're going to do with it. But I do have a new iTunes review I'm going to read, and I'm always read these out if I can. And I got one from Coin Queen. I'm guessing that's you, Bone Princess, because you told me over Discord you were sending one. And it's a 5-star review. It says, "Hidden Gem. Recently came across this podcast. I've never listened to anything quite like it and wasn't sure how I'd like it. Turns out it's great. If you like movies, you will love this. KiramidHead, sometimes along with guests, offer funny, insightful commentary while taking listeners through the good, bad, and weird of unproduced scripts. KiramidHead has a great way of walking listeners through the scripts. It feels as if you're seeing the film version unfold in front of you. Highly recommended." Thank you very much for that, Coin Queen, aka Bone Princess, if that is in fact you. I always appreciate getting reviews. If they're good, bad, negative, I will take whatever you send my way, and I will totally listen to them and read them out on the podcast, unless I get like a whole bunch within the space of a month, in which case I might have to prune a bit just for practicality reasons. And to get into the background portion of the episode, Suspiria is one of those classic horror films which most people, if they haven't seen it, they at least have an idea of what it's like. It's a film I saw relatively recently, almost 5 years ago now, back when live stream was still a thing, and I had a group of online friends who would get together and we would live stream some movies or whatnot on there. And I went through a whole Fulci phase, and some random stuff, and then an Argento phase, which led right into the October of that year. And sadly, I hadn't used it in years, but when I got the message that live stream did not exist anymore and that got bought out and shut down by Vimeo, that was like, that was kind of a heartbreaking moment. But the original Suspiria is an incredible cinematic experience. It's less of a narrative film and more of just an overbearing, insane atmosphere, weird scenes, weird stuff going on, brutal kills. And it's a film where I can't talk enough about it, and it's one of those films where even if you don't end up liking it, it's worth watching it at least once, just to say you experienced this crazy, weird, unique little film. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it as we go along, because the script does kind of, do some things which are kind of, deliberate sort of departures or references to the original. So I will have to talk about that to an extent during the script portion of this. And kind of sort of got two sequels, and I say kind of sort of because they're not really directly linked in any way other than just like a couple of references. You got Inferno in 1980, where Argento went to make it, and he made, basically the reason why he made it a sequel to Suspiria is because they said, we'll give you all this money, but you have to make a Suspiria sequel, because Suspiria in 77 was a big success. And Inferno is interesting, and it had the potential to be even better and crazier than Suspiria, because it's got a lot of crazy stuff in it still. It expands the mythology. That's where the whole three mothers thing comes into it. And it just has a number of just crazy scenes, crazy ideas, memorable moments. But it doesn't quite hit the same highs as Suspiria does for me. It's a little too vague at times. It's a little too weird for the sake of weird. Like, there's this whole subplot in the middle that absolutely kills the pacing of the movie about this bookstore owner who it only seems to exist so there can be a scene where a guy literally walks on water so he can run over and stab him. Like, that seems to be the only reason that's in the movie. And it does this thing in the first act where if it had worked out better, I would be fine with this. But it essentially plays musical chairs with its protagonists, where you think one person's the main character, then they die. And then you think this other person is the main character, and then they die. And then it finally settles on the main guy for the movie, who's played by, I think he was a soap opera actor. And he's just really bland and horribly unconvincing in the movie. And it's made even worse by the fact that Argento's first choice was supposedly James Woods, but he had a scheduling conflict and couldn't do it. And I'm like, I could only imagine how amazing that would have been with James Woods. Like, he would have brought a whole new level to the movie. But like I said, even with my problems with it, it's still a very worthwhile film to watch at least once. Like, I don't think it's as good as Suspiria, but I think it's quite good in its own right. Now, the third film in this so-called Three Mothers trilogy, which is The Mother of Tears, which I still to this day have not seen, because it was made like decades after the fact. And I've heard it's not very good. I've heard it's nothing like the other two in terms of style and approach. And it's late period Argento, which is almost always kind of disappointing and not very good. I mean, this is the same late period of Argento where he made fucking Dracula 3D, which is one of the worst fucking Dracula movies I've seen. And I've seen a lot of terrible Dracula movies, dear God. But yeah, I just really, maybe I'll get around to watching it one day, but I'm not in any rush. Now, of course, that brings us eventually to the Suspiria remake that we did get, directed by Luca Guadagnino, and I love this remake. I think it's just as good as the original in its own way. It does a completely different thing with it. It takes its own approach, and I think that's for the best. It doesn't try to one-up Suspiria or equal Suspiria. It tries to take some of the ideas and some of the plot points and just push it in a direction, execute it completely differently, and I think it works beautifully. Like, there's a few things here and there where I'm like, I'm not really entirely sure this adds up, but I think the cast is great. I think it's incredibly well directed. It's got a great atmosphere all on its own. And it's got at least one insanely memorable fucked up scene in the form of that mirror room dance sequence. Holy fucking shit. Like, I knew that was coming because I had heard about it before I saw the movie, but nothing prepares you for watching that scene. I saw this in the theater, which was thankfully I did, because that's incredible. It was incredible seeing it on a big screen like that. But dear Lord, that scene, holy shit. So yeah, that movie is really, really good in its own right, and I highly recommend you go and search it out and give it a shot. And even if you don't end up liking it, it's worth giving it a shot just because it does so much right. And to move on to the version I'm going to be talking about today, when the idea of a remake was first announced in 2008, Guadagnino was just going to produce it, and he hired David Gordon Green, who had started out as sort of an indie darling, directing these kind of, indie dramas, like these serious sort of, well-acclaimed dramas, and he transitioned into doing like stoner comedies for a while. And I've seen bits and pieces of Pineapple Express, and I thought it was funny enough. I saw Joe with Nicolas Cage on the big screen because there was nothing else to see that week, and actually ended up enjoying that. And Halloween ended up being one of my favorite movies of last year, alongside the Suspiria remake, which was my favorite movie of last year. So all in all, we're kind of in the best timeline for me. But yeah, he's an interesting choice to direct, and he talks about, what he was going to do. Initially, it was going to be Natalie Portman in the lead. And then she did Black Swan, and he started thinking, maybe I should, move in a bit of a different direction and go maybe with a younger cast, bring in more of a teenage angle, someone who would actually be in school, of that age. And so he went to Natalie Portman and said, hey, let's do Your Highness. And so they did that, and that movie bombed, which probably was the reason why they couldn't get funding to do Suspiria after that. But he went in a different direction. He cast a bunch of people. Isabel Fuhrman was supposed to play, the lead of Susie. And actresses and actors who didn't have any specified roles, like he had Isabel Huppert and Janet McTeer, who are respected actors. And I've seen Michael Nyqvist associated with this. He was the bad guy in the first John Wick, and he was the bad guy in Mission Impossible 4, among other things. And he was in like the Swedish girl with the dragon tattoo. Good actor. I'm not too sure who he would have played in this, but they were writing it, and he described it as, Let me find the quote for what he called it. He said, I love Argento's film, and we wrote a very faithful, extremely elegant opera. I don't mean musical opera, but it would be incredibly heightened music, and heightened and very operatic. We had an amazing cast of elegance and prestige that we were engineering for it. So it sounds like he was very interested in doing this, and like he definitely had like a strong sort of vision for the way he wanted to direct it. And I've lost my fucking train of thought here. But basically what happened is that he couldn't get the funding together for it because he wanted something like, let me see if I can find the comment on it. He says it was very expensive. He says it was very expensive and never ended up getting made. And I believe I've seen a comment from him saying that at the time he did with the budget he wanted, unless your horror movie was like a Paranormal Activity or a Saw movie, nobody wanted to fund it. So that's why his version didn't end up happening, and ended up moving on to Guadagnino, who, built up a rep as like an Oscar-nominated director and stuff like that, and he made his version. So moving on to the script, the draft I have is dated September? What the fuck is wrong with you, Bruce? It doesn't say September. It's dated January 3rd, 2012. So this would be the version after Natalie Portman left, and he moved on, and he wrote it with a younger cast in mind. And it starts with, it opens on black, there's a piano chord striking, and the woman's voice says, "Let us begin." So that's sort of like the interesting way to open it. It's evocative. And so we find ourselves in a music classroom in Munich, Germany, where instructor Teresa Bannon, and 9 months pregnant, goes into labor. And she's taken to an old house in the city by a friend named Vivica Crumb, who is apparently her sister. As we find out later, like, it's kind of confusing the way characters are related in this, and you'll kind of see what I mean as we go along. And the birth is presided over by a midwife named Roberta Blanc, and that's confusing because she's given a completely different first name later on in the script. And so Blanc takes the baby girl into an adjoining room, where an ancient woman touches the baby, and Blanc prays to Satan to protect her. And as she speaks, we see the symbol of the Theosophical Society on the wall, and then the scene fades to Susie Bannon, the baby who is now 17, who's on an airplane. Okay, so I gotta talk about this opening. We kind of get the idea that whatever she's going to be running into is going to be involving Satanists or witches. Right here from this opening scene, we know that Susie herself is going to be significant. I think it's kind of maybe giving a little too much away too early. And also, the Theosophical Society, like, the symbol they described being like a star with an Ouroboros snake surrounding it is an actual symbol of the Theosophical Society, but last I checked, Theosophy has nothing to do with fucking Satan worship or witchcraft. It's just this weird 19th century founded occult society that believed all this weird shit. I mean, I don't think it's actually like a literal satanic church or anything the way it's portrayed here. And so we then see a young woman named Patricia fleeing from unseen forces in a forest before coming upon a small German town. A couple named Bernard and Alma take her in, letting her spend the night. They ask a few questions, only finding out that she came from some place called the Academy before leaving her for the night in a room on the 4th floor. And so not long after, Patricia looks out the window, her reflected eyes staying as she turns away, and that's where we get the idea that she's on the 4th floor, because she looks out the window. And her eyes staying in the window is actually kind of a cool image. Then she gets attacked by hands that crash through the window and surround her, and it's supposed to be just like this almost endless number of hands. And so Bernard and Alma burst in, and they see this horrific sight, and they hear Patricia say in an almost kind of demonic voice, "Beware of the iris," before falling out the window, and her body is found outside, her face impaled on the fence. So we're taking some inspiration from Punisher Max here for the death scenes. So yeah, we get a different version of the original opening death scene of Patricia, or Pat as she's called. A funny bit of trivia here. Her name, she's always called Patricia in these remake versions because her last name is Hingle, and so having characters go around saying, one of our students, Pat Hingle, as they do in the original, you're just thinking, the fuck? Commissioner Gordon was a girl in a dance school? What the hell's going on? And this is sort of, one of my problems with this script early on is that it seems like it's just doing, like, things from the original movie and just changing them up somewhat. And there's multiple instances of stuff like this throughout the script where it's just kind of like, oh, you're just doing something from the original, not doing anything too horribly different with it. Now, granted, instead of just being one hand crashing through the window and then hanging her, stabbing her and then hanging her, like all these like hands coming in essentially from thin air is actually a pretty strong image, but still. And so elsewhere, Susie arrives in Germany at an airport and takes a taxi cab to the Academy, which is this all-girls boarding school, passing through the town from earlier on the way to its remote location in the forest. When she arrives, she catches a glimpse of a maintenance man named Pavlo, who smiles at her and meets with an administrator named Miss Tanner, who informs her of the basics of the Academy. She also has strange symbols tattooed on her hand, as well as a bank of security monitors in her office. Now, I didn't take notes of this hardly at all, but there are places in the script where it does cut to like the POV of like security cameras. Like 3 or 4 sprinkled throughout, but it's not a whole lot. And then Tanner informs Susie that communication with the outside world is restricted because they have this philosophical idea about how like the isolation will breed, and not relying on technology will breed like whatever mindset they want in the students or something like that. So it's one of the more clever ways of working around, cell phones in a modern day set horror movie that I can think of. In fact, there's even one point in the script where like what's going on, it's described as being like 2012 by way of like 1982 or something like that. So yeah, it's definitely playing on the whole, this is why they don't have, the technology. But, she already knew about that, but Susie already knew about this because her Aunt Vivica told her about it, and she left everything behind. Tanner also has Christopher, a young assistant, takes Susie's bags to her room. And so Tanner takes Susie on tour of the facilities and introduces her to Madame Blanc, who's now the directress of the Academy. And she mentions having known her mother and having met Susie as an infant. And we also learned that Vivica is Susie's aunt and raised her after her mother died. And she was very ill until recently, but is now better. And that's the start of a weird, not really a subplot throughout this thing. Like it's something that comes up every now and then. And Blanc shows Susie a portrait of the Academy's founder, Helena Marcos, who they specifically say in the scene directions is the old woman from the opening. And during this scene, we also meet Blanc's young nephew, Albert, who plays very roughly with Pavlo's dog, Bruno. So yeah, Bruno in this, the dog, actually I'll talk about it in a second. Tanner introduces Pavlo to Susie and tells her about how he had all of his teeth replaced recently. And there's a strange moment where Blanc's eyes change color, and then tells Tanner that she approves of Susie, but in German, so presumably because Susie can't understand German. The tour continues, and they look in on the class where a blind piano player named Daniel is working. This is where I gotta talk about my point about the dog. In the original movie, the dog belonged to the blind piano player, and Pavlo, instead of being like a maintenance man, he's this weird tall guy who wanders around, and the whole thing about him losing his teeth was in there too. And he doesn't speak English, he only speaks Romanian. There's this weird scene where Blanc is like You can say whatever you want to him because he can't understand you. And I'm like, wow, bitch. So they've kind of mixed around some of the characters here and given them slightly different roles. And so Susie, she gets introduced to a class full of her fellow students, and there's some tension there. And then she meets with Olga, her haughty new roommate, and the bookish but friendly Sarah. Susie moves into the dorm room with Olga, where we learned that Patricia was living there until recently, and that she supposedly was expelled for not living up to the Academy's philosophy. And, oh yeah, this whole thing about her being expelled and disappearing, and them going like, oh, we don't know what's going on with her, that gets completely thrown out later on, and it's like, okay, why? And, Christopher brings her trunks to the room, and there's an immediate spark between the two of them. And Olga asks if he has a boyfriend back home. Gotta fix my misspelling in the notes real quick. But Susie says that her aunt was very strict about relationships. And later, Susie is taken to Dr. Verdigast, who performs a physical examination of her. And Verdigast he is a character in the original movie. When I see that name printed out, all I think about is Bela Lugosi as Dr. Vitos Verdigast in The Black Cat, that crazy character. So the girls are taken on a run around the campus, and Susie and Sarah bond when they both fall behind and finish last. And then later, Susie calls Aunt Vivica, who tells her that going there was for the best, and that the Academy chose her for her talent, which is kind of true. And so Susie then talks with Sarah in the cafeteria, where she tells her that her aunt homeschooled her, but always taught her these weird, unconventional things, and the list is actually quite weird, if I can find it. Yeah, I'm looking for it right now. It's here somewhere. It was never like a normal school. We would study nature and elements, survival, and random things. She would make me memorize a book backwards and sing it to her underwater, stuff like that. There was no purpose. And Sarah's like, well, my parents just abandoned me here because they didn't want anything to do with me. And so, okay, that evening at the Academy's indoor swimming pool, Olga flirts with Christopher, but she doesn't get anywhere with him, but it turns out it's just a distraction so she can snag his key to the pool room, which for some reason the script insists on referring to as a nonatorium, which I guess is an actual term for it. I've never actually heard that before now. And that night, Susie awakes, hearing an argument in German. She looks out the window and sees Blanc and Tanner reprimanding a little red-headed girl. Susie doesn't realize it, but Pavlo is watching from the shadows and sees her at the window. I don't even know why I bother taking some of this stuff down. It's just random weirdness that I don't think actually gets... Susie closes the window and Olga wakes up, asking her to come have some fun. A number of students then party in the pool, some of them even engaging in sexual activities, including a same-sex menage a trois, all of which is more than a little shocking for the sheltered Susie. A high camera angle then implies that they're being watched. So it went from being Suspiria to being a Japanese ecchi anime, if I'm even pronouncing that right. Like a school set lesbian ecchi, I guess. For just that one scene. I don't think this whole thing about them having weird sex orgies in the pool ever comes back. And so the next day, Pavlo is working on some electrical wires, bemoaning the state of the building, and there's like another staff member going, oh, don't you criticize the building or something like that. And Susie is outside the kitchen when this happens. He accidentally causes a blackout, and she's outside the kitchen when this happens, and she sees the light reflect off of a knife being used by the cook, who's a pregnant woman named Veda, and which blinds Susie as if it were glowing, and it seems like there's light reflecting off of all like the silverware and stuff piled up in the kitchen. And she then gets sick and vomits in the class where the students are strapped into extreme exercise equipment. It's like a weird thing where they have to get strapped down to it and spread eagled, and the thing gets spun around and stretches them. And they say the point of this is that it's to find the space between pleasure and pain. And all I can think of is this place being run by witches or is it being run by Cenobites? I mean, that sounds like the kind of thing the Cenobites would do. And like one of the teachers, who's Miss Ebsen, I think, is going like, or Ebsen. Yeah, Ebsen is like, oh, how dare you get sick in here? And there's a Miss Ramsden who is being sympathetic towards her in this scene. And so Verdigast, she goes to visit Verdigast, and he has her put on an IV for a bit, as well as a restricted diet, including wine, which once again is a carried over plot point from the original. And Susie and Olga talk, the latter saying this usually happens early on and that it won't happen anymore once. Basically, you have to get acclimated to the extremity of the curriculum. And she intimates that Verdigast is something of a pervert, which you never really get from any of his scenes. Like, he is kind of creepy and weird, but I never got like a sexual vibe off the guy. He just seemed just strange. And she then tells Susie this story about Helena Marcos, how she became demented in her old age and pushed the academy to study the occult, and that she collapsed in a circle of fire trying to raise the dead and was institutionalized until she died. And she also says that the students pass around rumors that Marcos is still alive and that who for some reason is given the completely different first name of Monica here, who took over after her alleged death, uses her power, which comes from the devil, which is used to feed on young girls and live forever. And then Olga goes, but they're just stories. And that's when maggots begin to rain down from the ceiling all over the dormitory. Tanner, Pavlo, and Veda go to investigate the attic. Tanner reprimands and smacks Pavlo, which Christopher witnesses before they go into the attic, where she tells Veda to prepare to accept the consequences. They find that the maggots came from a specific crate, but we don't see what's inside it. And there's a brief moment where Susie's in the garden and she turns around and Daniel's right behind her and she freaks out. Now this whole thing with the maggots in the attic, it's from the original movie. And they pop open the crate and you see maggots are crawling all over something in there, but you don't know what it is, and they never actually explain that. Here, Tanner pops it open and you don't see what's going on in there, and I'm like, are they hiding a dead body in there? Is that what's going on? But yeah. And so Blanc meets with the students in the library, where she explains that they use the attic as overflow storage for cases of meat, some of which must have arrived spoiled, which is the same excuse they give in the original. And she says that they'll use the ballroom as a makeshift dormitory until the rooms can be fumigated in the morning. And this is something that happens in the original too. And there's a strange teacher with a small head sitting in the shadows during this scene as well. And the temporary accommodations are set up, and we see Albert snarling at Bruno, and the girls settle in for the night. Now, I don't know why there's a weird teacher with a small head sitting in the background. I don't know why that's mentioned in the script. That seems like something you would if you're going to do weird imagery like that, come up with it on set. It doesn't need to be in the script. It doesn't add anything. It's just weird. And also, I should say that whole backstory about Helena Marcos that we get there, whether it's real or not, isn't actually from the original. In the original, all you find out is that she was the member of a cult and there was a fire and she supposedly died in the fire. And then there's the whole thing where they talk about how in the dance school, they talk about things like how, she's still alive, but she's out traveling, and that's why you never see the directress and stuff like that. Blanc is supposed to be the assistant directress, and that's why, and she's running things while Marcos is away. It's all quite paper thin, really, when you think about it. And okay, so while they're sleeping in the ballroom, Susie has a vivid dream and then awakes and heads to the bathroom to get a drink of water. Now, I'm assuming she awakes because the script doesn't actually say. It says she's dreaming, and then it just says she's walking down the hallway. So I'm guessing that's on purpose to kind of disorient the audience a little bit. And she hears Patricia's voice repeating her last words about the iris from earlier in the movie, not realizing who it is or what it means, and doesn't notice someone spying on her through a peephole. And she has an encounter with Christopher in the hallway where they hear an old woman scream and see Pavlo stumble around shirtless. And Christopher says it's not the time to ask questions and sends Susie back to bed, where she talks with Sarah. They hear labored breathing coming from the windows overlooking the ballroom, followed by the sound of a breathing machine. And it fades to black over this, and it says this is where the end of part 1. This is where part 1 ends, so the movie is divided into 2 acts, maybe with an intermission, I don't know. So yeah, that scene is sort of in the original where they can hear Marcos breathing, and that's where the Mother of Sighs name comes from, is the fact that she has this labored breathing. Because in the original, Helena Marcos is supposed to be the Mater Suspiriorum, the Mother of Sighs. Which, you wouldn't get that from just watching Suspiria, you'd have to assume that from watching Inferno. But okay, so part 2 begins, and okay, here we are. I scrolled too far in my notes. The next morning, Susie calls her aunt, who doesn't pick up the phone, and it actually shows her sitting there in her chair by the phone, not picking it up. And Susie then attends a painting class in the garden where she asks Miss Ramsden, that sympathetic teacher from earlier, about the heavy breathing, and she dodges the question, saying it must have been the building set. And then Susie and Sarah immediately know she's lying, and they go to investigate. They poke around in the attic, but they don't find anything, and they spot Blanc rubbing a painting of an iris in her office. And then, not long after this, Albert runs back into the building, crying and bleeding, apparently having been bit by Bruno. Now, this happens in the movie, but I believe it happens earlier. I believe the kid getting bitten by the dog happens much, much earlier in the movie. And then the thing where they have to move into the ballroom for the night, that happens later. And Tanner orders Pavlo to have the dog put down, and when he refuses, she fires him on the spot. And then he rambles about how they steal the souls of girls and they're all trapped in the building, but he can leave before he leaves. And Susie and Sarah, they watch as this happens, and this is when Susie confides in Sarah, saying that her aunt caught a terrible sickness, the same one her mother died of, including a tumor, that only alternative medicine overseen by 3 old women was able to fix. The last part of her treatment requires strict isolation, so she sent Susie away to finish school at the academy. She also wants Susie to follow in her mother's footsteps. It's then that a scurrying mouse leads them to a loose brick in the wall, where they find Patricia's diary. So yeah, interesting coincidence. I'm trying to remember where Sarah got the diary from in the original, because I think she just had it, like Patricia trusted her with it or something like that. And in the remake, the psychiatrist gives it to her. And Aunt Vivica calls Susie back and says her condition is now gone and wants her to return home. And Susie says she prefers to stay at the school, and apparently, she says, I know you're just testing me or something like that. And they say they love each other before ending the call. And we then see that Vivica is in the company of the 3 old women, 2 of whom speak, and the third one is just playing with a doll, I think, saying that Susie is a child of the academy now and that she lives only to extend the life of Helena Marcos. And then Vivica tells them to go away and leave her alone. And the next scene, it intercuts a scene of the academy staff having a function of some sort in the tea room. Pavlo, he's in a pub, and then he's walking the abandoned streets of the town after dark with his dog. And he's approached by unseen supernatural forces and then is attacked and killed by the dog. Now, in the original movie, that's not Pavlo, it's Daniel who gets fired, and it's his seeing eye dog that kills him, which then Fulci kind of ripped off for The Beyond, but The Beyond is still awesome. And the next day, the students are discussing this, and Sarah has Susie go for a swim with her. She says that she's been reading Patricia's diary, and she says that Patricia became increasingly obsessed with the facility, and is now convinced that she was killed and not expelled. She then asks Susie if she believes in witches, and it cuts away right after that. And so Susie then meets with Christopher, who says that Pavlo helped him with his anger problem after he had an accident, and they have a brief romantic moment where they kiss. And Susie returns to her room, where she finds Blanc waiting. She knows what Susie has been doing and orders her to get psychologically evaluated by Verdigast. This whole thing with them gaslighting Susie and going we're going to try and control you, blah, 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 is something where it's I'm not overly fond of those kinds of plots in movies when they do them. And in the original, they just watch her because they know she knows something weird is going on. And so at first they're just watching her and, trying to keep her, under control. But they don't do any of this weird, we're going to force you to get psychological treatment and stuff like that. And then they just decide, oh, you know too much, we're going to kill you. And that's literally the last 5 minutes of the movie when they decide. And also this whole thing with Christopher, the assistant, there's a character sort of like him in the original movie named Mark, who's also this poor guy who doesn't have any money and Tanner bosses him around. But he doesn't get any backstory, and it's implied that there's some sort of spark of attraction between him and Susie, but it doesn't go anywhere. Played out as more of a love interest thing here, and I'm not entirely sure it works or is necessary. But yeah, it's another thing I'm not overly fond of. And so Susie is prescribed sleeping pills and kept in the clinic by the doctor, but she avoids taking the pills. She tongues them and then spits them out. And that night, Susie reads from the diary, taping the door shut and covering the windows as she does. And she goes to, her room shut and covering the windows as she does. She goes to the clinic later and gives Susie the diary, saying that Marcos is still alive, and that Patricia figured out the history of the academy, built by a man named Varelli as one of 3 institutions for the 3 mothers. And she then says that the Black Queen, who is presumably Marcos, plans to sacrifice 100 girls to the devil while keeping 3 souls and 1 body for herself. Now, this whole idea that, and you can figure out at this point where it's going to go, that Marcos wants Susie's body so that her existence can continue. That's the only plot point, really, that from this that carried on over into the remake that we actually got, the idea that Marcos is really old and decrepit and she needs a new body to hop into. It plays way differently in that movie than it does here, but it is the only thing basically that was carried over. And also all this stuff with Varelli and him building 3 houses for 3 mothers, that is entirely from Inferno. I don't know how that would have flown, because I think the rights to Inferno are a completely different thing to the rights for Suspiria. I don't think that, I don't know if they would be able to get away with that. There might have been some legal kerfluffle over that. And so Sarah hears footsteps and flees, heading for her room, only to find that figures in cloaks and prosthetic masks are watching the door. She flees to the cellar and tries to hide, but she gets rumbled by Albert. and she flees down the long hallway, and there's the POV of an unseen presence following her. She hides in a storage room full of junk, including a pile of razor wire. She attempts to climb out the window, but she can't open it, which is when the door opens a crack, letting light in, and Sarah begins to bleed from the eyes and leak milk from the mouth, and her body convulses as the door opens all the way, and she crawls towards the door, which is now half the size as before, and she goes out, and she sees a mountain of razor wire between her and the light, and she goes to climb it, cutting herself as she does. And she gives up in exhaustion, and the wire embraces her as a voice commands her to bleed, followed by a horn emerging from below and piercing her heart. Now that is actually a really cool remix of the Susie death scene from the original, because she flees into the attic in that version, and she crawls through a window between rooms when whoever is chasing her is, about to open the door. And even though she looks through the window and can obviously see what's in the room, she just falls into this massive pile of razor wire. And okay, that's weird. I like how weird and surreal it plays out here, where she's in the room and then the door gets smaller, and then she crawls through it, and then she's just crawling through this massive mountain of razor wire, almost as if she shrank. It's a pretty cool scene. And so the next morning, Susie goes to Sarah's room, and finding it a mess, and Olga and Tanner say she disappeared, fleeing into the night. Susie goes to meet with Madame Blanc, who asks her about Sarah. She also says that she tried to gain custody over Susie, but Vivica prevented that and fled to America, which is why they had their falling out. Blanc tells Susie to give up her suspicions and allow herself to learn from them. There's a quick scene of Vivica looking through mementos of her time with Teresa, and she finds a dagger and a satanic prayer book, the latter of which she burns. Now, I do like this idea of Blanc trying to persuade her to sort of come over to their way of thinking. I would have liked a little bit more of that as opposed to just the gaslighting and general assholery of what goes on in this script. I do genuinely enjoy some of the stuff that they do here. And so Susie is approached by Miss Ramsden, that teacher who is sympathetic towards her in those previous scenes, and she explains to Susie that her mother and aunt had an incident with Blanc in their youth but maintained her influence over something, I guess over the coven, I'm not sure, and that her aunt cut all ties with the institution after her mother died. And so the idea you get is that the disease they gave Vivica that Vivica caught was the coven basically trying to force her to send Susie to them, and that it's saying that it was the same disease her mother had. I guess it means that they killed her mother as well. And she also says that her aunt's strange curriculum was designed to make Susie some kind of hunter, and this is all very vague, and I'm not really sure what it's supposed to convey. And that maintain her good and grace in the presence of darkness or something, and that she was trained to expose the academy, telling her that she can't escape her fate. Also, she mentions that she swore her allegiance to Mater Superiorum and that her life is now forfeit for helping Susie. This is intercut with Aunt Vivica having 3 old women over for dinner before slashing their throats with the dagger, saying the hunt has begun. So she kills those witches. And basically the idea you're getting here is that Susie is supposed to be the special savior for the coven, but that Vivica has basically set her up to basically be their downfall. And you get 3 more exposition scenes after. There's 3 exposition scenes in this third act here, and it's good lord, condense this stuff down. And so Christopher meets with Susie in the clinic and encourages her to escape, telling her to run straight through the forest until she reaches town. She does so and steals clothes from a clothesline to hide that she came from the academy, and she waits for Christopher, reading from Sarah's diary. It further mentions the idea that the Black Queen is looking for a new body. And also during the scene, we see Blanc upset about Susie's disappearance, ordering the staff to find her. And the reading from Sarah's diary, it's even more vague, not very well explained exposition, to the point where it's you might as well just cut this stuff out, because it's already been explained. Susie meets with Christopher, and they talk in the local park and the pub, and he explains that Marcos was one of 3 sisters, daughters of a founder of Theosophy described as an occult science group. Their mother was hanged for witchcraft, and the sisters separated, Marcos becoming a respected novelist and founding the academy. She's still alive, but expected to die at any time, requiring a new body to continue living, which we've been told 4 times by now. He confirms that Marcos is indeed the Black Queen, and he says there's something about magic in the bloodline because Susie is her granddaughter, and that Susie's mother was killed when she wouldn't go along with the plans. I'm like, what? This whole thing about her being Marcos's granddaughter is just, where did this come from exactly? It's just thrown in here very close to the end. And they're then spotted in the pub by Olga, and Christopher tells her to flee as everyone starts to look at them and various members of the staff show up. Susie hides in the bathroom but is found by Blanc before passing out, and she wakes in the clinic tied to the bed, which he manages to escape from in about 30 seconds. She finds a phone calling for help, however the voice on the other end of the line only speaks German and fades into laughter before the line goes dead. Now that genuinely creeped me out. Susie is startled by the sight of Patricia's walking corpse, which is babbling madly, which disappears, and then disappears when Susie looks the other way. Susie heads to the kitchen and grabs a knife, and then sees members of the staff moving down the hallway and follows them. Meanwhile, Albert discovers that Susie has escaped her bond. Susie follows the staff members and sees Albert run past her, and also notices that in her portrait, Marcos has the same wrist tattoo as Tanner. Why we need that reveal, we don't know. We could just assume the symbols tattooed on her wrist were some weird occult thing. We don't need that reveal. And she follows the staff members to Blanc's office, which turns up empty when she gets there. She hides when she hears footsteps, and she observes Miss Ramsden enter, and she's watching her through the mirror this whole time. She takes a key off a key hook, and she opens a keyhole behind the painting of an iris, opening a secret door. Ramsden then says that she has paid with her life for helping... Whoa, what was that? My notes went weird for a second. That she has paid with her life for helping Susie, and she loads an antique gun and points it at her reflection in the mirror that Susie is watching for, and then shoots. And the mirror shatters, and she crumples to the ground with a bullet hole in her head from where her reflection shot her. Now that is weirdness worthy of an Argento movie. Holy crap, like, the script does have some inspired moments here and there. And okay, this thing about the iris here, I don't even know why we needed Patricia to babble about Beware the Iris and, like, have her ghost or whatever appear to, Susie and say something about it, because Susie's not the one who figures out the meaning of the iris thing here. In the original, she hears her say something about an iris, but doesn't quite grok what's going on in that scene, because Patricia, like, runs out the door of the academy right as Susie gets there, and she babbles something to you later find out it's Sarah. And you can't hear what she says at first, and Susie can't make it out either, and she doesn't quite figure out what she meant until later, and she's explaining how you open the irises in Blanc's office to get down to the cult center below. But here it's just like, oh, Ramsden just points the way to her, so Susie doesn't really figure anything out on her own. Susie finds Susie finds that the entrance to the office has disappeared, and the sound of Christopher's cries draw her to the hidden passageway. She descends, seeing Blanc, Daniel, Vertigas, and the rest of the coven through a doorway in what's called the ceremonial room. She hides behind a rock and watches as Blanc makes some sort of satanic prayer condemning Christopher, who kneels before her. And Olga is also there, stretched out on the floor, and it's implied that this is some kind of initiation ritual is going on here with her. And Blanc has Christopher taken from the room by 3 mysterious teachers, as they're called, and heads off down the dark passageway. Now, Susie follows, and she finds 2 staff members digging a grave, and then Blanc appears behind her and tries to kill her, rambling about how you could have been with us, you could have been powerful, but now you have to die. And I'm like, I don't understand why there's this whole thing about why she has to die. Does the body that Marcos takes over, does it have to be willingly given? That's never stated. It just gets weird, and I'm not really sure what's going on. But Susie stabs her to death and flees down the passageway, and the staff members bury Blanc in the grave, which I guess was being prepared for either Susie or Christopher, and they just went, waste not, want not, and dump the bitch in the hole. And at the bottom, she finds Helena Marcos' room, where her legless, withered body sleeps, attached to a breathing machine, before Susie accidentally wakes her up, and Marcos at first tries to persuade her to go along with her plan, but she tries to flee, and the door cracks open, she sees hands come around the corner, and watching through a mirror once again, she sees Sarah's walking, torch-bearing corpse come through the door, and she also gets confronted by Patricia's crawling corpse. And during all of this, we see Christopher getting beaten in Blanc's office by the 3 coven members, tied up students in the dormitory getting eaten by dogs, and more students lining up by the pool for Vertigas to ritually drown them, and so I guess those are the 100 students that are going to be sacrificed. And in Marcos' room, she and Susie fight. Susie tries to stab her, only for some sort of energy to block the knife and knock it out of her hands. Marcos begins to strangle her. When she's being strangled, that's when, stuff starts to go bad for people in the school. But Susie manages to get the knife again and cut her neck, which causes everything to go haywire in the academy. Vertigas is overwhelmed by the dead, and I guess by that it means the corpses of the children he drowned by the pool. And he's like, you don't see what happens to him. He's just, shouting prayers in Latin. And Daniel and the awakened Olga, who their eyes have changed, it said, in some way, and they're like beginning to like fuck in the room. And by the way, Daniel, not a member of the Coven in the original movie. He just knows stuff about them. They begin to suffocate on nothing, and that's what happens to the cult members in the original movie, is that Marcos gets killed, and then they all start to suffocate in the room that they're in. And the corpse of Sarah collapses and drops the torch, which sets the academy aflame. Susie hacks off Marcos's head with the knife, absorbing what's left of her power, as it says, and then runs straight through the fire and back to Blanc's office, where she grabs Christopher and carries him out of there. She blasts the doors off the building with her newfound powers and takes Christopher out of there, where they run through the woods to a road where Vivica picks them up in a car and drives them away as the academy burns. And I guess they just went, fuck all the other students, let's let them burn to death. And that's where it ends. Not unlike the original movie where the building just starts burning down and Susie runs out and she just walks away calmly in the rain. On the whole, it's an interesting read, has some very interesting imagery, and I would say it does mostly work pretty well. I mean, it would work better if I could see it directed and up on screen. But on the page, it can get a little tedious going like, here's this random detail. Here's this random detail. And the impression I get from it is that it feels like David Gordon Green, what he's trying to do is it's like he's trying to do the original Suspiria only bigger and crazier. And all due respect, I respect the ambition of that, but I just don't think that fully works. Like, I don't think that's like a good approach to take, because you're never going to be able to outdo Suspiria at what Suspiria did best. And some of the best things about the remake we did eventually get were in the ways it sort of subverted what you would expect if you've seen the original. Like, Patricia is in the very first scene, but you don't see her die. Like, I mean, you don't actually see what happens to her, and you don't find out until much, much, much later on. And so it makes her a really solid, creepy reveal when you do find out what happened to her. And so there's that, and there's the different roles Marcos, Blanc, and Susie end up playing and how the ending plays out. Whereas this just feels like it's Suspiria again, only with different weird shit going on in it. And it's one of those things where it's such a strongly visual concept, I would almost need to see it, directed and produced on screen in order to fully judge it. So it's weird. I can say I'm not a huge fan of this script. I'd have to see it, portrayed visually in order to get a better idea of what it was going for. Like, for example, I know David Gordon Green actually was trying to get the rights to the Suspiria score by Goblin, which is this whole complicated other thing. Like, that's one of the other things that delayed it for so long, was there were rights issues. Like, they had to get the rights to the film, and they had to get Argento to play Ball, I think, and they were trying to get the score, so they had to get Goblin to play Ball, and all sorts of other things. And I just don't know if doing the same thing with the same score with just different weird shit happening, I don't know if that would have flew. I think the people who didn't like the remake for not having the crazy colors and not having the score and stuff like that, maybe they would have preferred this. Or maybe they would have looked at this it's just the original all over again, just done slightly differently. I'm not really sure how this would have played for an audience. But, so yeah, basically what happened with this was that David Gordon Green wanted a lot of money to make it. Like, I think it was like 30 million, not that much money by like the huge budget standards we have today, but like I think it's like 30, 40 million he wanted for it, which really isn't all that much in terms of today's film budgets. But because it was a horror movie and his last movie, Your Highness, had hugely flopped at the box office, nobody wanted to fund this. And he said that at the time, the only horror movies anybody wanted to fund was stuff like Saw or Paranormal Activity. So that killed it. And eventually Guadagnino, who was producing at the time, he got Dave Kajanik to write it, who did an excellent job. And they put together a brilliant film. So David Gordon Green got to go make Halloween, which I love. And the Suspiria remake that came out within scant weeks of that movie, I also loved. And they were both in my top 5 of last year. So in terms of, Suspiria, and David Gordon Green, I'm kind of living in the best timeline. So I'm perfectly happy with what we got, but this is an interesting look into an alternative idea of how to remake it. So yeah, I think that sums it up pretty well. As usual, if you enjoyed the show, check us out on Facebook, Tumblr, Twitter, go to iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, Google Play Music. Contact us at screenplayarchaeology@outlook.com. And hopefully you enjoyed the episode. And until next time, bye.